Right. So I'm here talking again with Chloe Valdary. I love your work, Chloe. You work on the theory of enchantment. That's the name of your company. And you teach social and emotional learning in schools, as well as diversity and inclusion in companies and government agencies. And one of the ways you do this is through exploring the timeless stories and narratives that are expressed in popular culture. And you often focus on Disney movies and characters and express this theory of enchantment and show its value in improving inclusion and diversity in organizations. So I love your work, and we talked about some information that came out from a Harvard Business Review article back in May, where the authors Laura Morgan Roberts, Megan Grayson, and Brooke Denard Rosser talked about this concept of microvalidations. Mm-hmm. So as opposed to microaggressions, which we want to avoid in the workplace, mm-hmm. microvalidations is about finding a point of difference and validating that through a brief comment or conversation or something like that. And I was really interested in your reaction to that from your point of view. So I just wonder if you'd give us some ideas on that, Chloe.
Sure. So I have to be honest, when I first read it, I thought it was kind of like common sense. Of course you want to validate people who you're taking care of in the workplace, your colleagues that you're trying to form community with. Just from a perspective of not just establishing rapport, but appreciating and expressing appreciation for the many gifts and talents and perspectives that people bring into the workplace by virtue of being different, which is to say by virtue of not being you, right? And that opportunity is open or available for everyone and anyone. Obviously, I would say this also dovetails with principle 2 of the theory of enchantment, which is criticized to uplift and empower. And I think that the root of that principle is the second part, which is uplift and empower, right? The premise being that uplifting and empowering people is the spirit that you want to take into all of the environments that you walk into, whether it be the workplace, whether it be interpersonal community. So I read it with a kind of, I guess, somewhat of an appreciation that it was present and being promoted, but also a kind of surprise that needed to be said in the first place.
Yeah, I get that, and I love that phrase, criticize to uplift and empower. If we could just keep that perspective, that would bring so much appreciation and enablement to the workplace, which I love. Yeah, and you're right. It is a bit disappointing that we have to point these things out. But having said that, we talk about validating and appreciating people. That's kind of normal, but doing that specifically about the point of difference seems to me that's perhaps the nuance that's added here, and in our validations to recognize and appreciate that. So I'm thinking, in a meeting to say, thank you for expressing your perspective on that from the point of view of, and without putting the person on the spot or making them feel awkward, somehow recognizing that difference, is saying, this is what makes you valuable to our group, our team, is the fact that you are different from the others.
Yeah, I think that last piece that you said is actually important, because you don't want to do it in such a way that singles the person out in a really awkward and best case scenario awkward, worst case scenario offensive way. And I think what comes into play here is the question of what you are honoring, or what, in service of what are you honoring the difference. So I feel like I need to talk a little bit about the business ecosystem specifically. to hone in on this point. And I experienced this at Theory of Enchantment, where when we're going through development of new services, it can be incredibly meaningful and critical to have diversity, not just from a superficial perspective, but diversity of approach. And in fact, you receive diversity of approaches, in my experience, not just from, let's say, your business partners, but also from the customers that you're serving or you're servicing. When your customers are engaging with your product or engaging with your service, and let's say that they give you negative feedback, that is a type of diversity. That type of diversity is actually very critical for you to improve upon the products and services that you offer. And I had to learn this was a very critical edge for me to be able to receive quote unquote negative feedback, so as to incorporate it so that I could iterate and make a better product or make a better service. But this reframe of seeing it through the lens of appreciation is actually incredibly important, not just for creating community, not just for creating a community of belonging among the staff, but creating a community of belonging in service of making the products and services that you offer to customers and that you co-create with customers and with colleagues. So I think that's a perhaps more pointed business case for showing appreciation of difference, because the opposite could also happen if you don't have a overall or overarching goal, right? If you come in, I'm making this up on the fly, so it could be not as good as I would have hoped, but if you come in and you provide a perspective and I make note of the fact that I'm younger than you in my appreciation of your perspective, if I don't ground it in something that makes sense or an objective goal that makes sense, but just awkwardly point out the fact that you're older than me, that's actually not, I don't think that's what the authors were intending to suggest when they wrote that piece. And you do see in a culture and an ecosystem where the kind of people are like gamifying superficial diversity. So people will be told, and I know this for a fact because I heard it today actually, people will be told that if they hire people who look a certain way and essentially fill racial quotas or gender quotas or any other quota you can imagine, that they will be receiving more compensation, right? From, let's say, a government authority or some private source. This is very dangerous because it gamifies superficial characteristics, as opposed to creating a culture of belonging where you show appreciation for difference in service of the overarching goal that all of you have agreed to move towards, right? That actually makes for a longer, sustained culture of belonging. And you can't sustain diversity without building the culture of belonging first. Because instead, if you try to put the cart before the horse, you'll hire people based upon superficial qualities. They won't be retained. They'll find your culture really boring at best, toxic at worst, and they'll end up leaving. Now, I've said a lot there, so I'll pause. But that's sort of how I'm thinking about this question of appreciation of difference.
Yeah, it's great. Make some great points. I always say that diversity is a number, right? And you can engineer that by your hiring practices or incentives, just as you described. But belonging or inclusion is a feeling.
Yes.
And that feeling is something that emerges out of the conditions you create. It's not something that you can control.
Yes.
So yeah, I totally agree with that. And I'm thinking too of the many cultures around the world, and I look at myself, and my culture was one of the few that doesn't do this, where, for example, older people in the community are called uncle or auntie. So many cultures, particularly in the Asia Pacific region, have that. And so there's something that brings, a certain respect or deference to a person that is older, which, sometimes that's problematic, but as part of the culture, the attitude, the eye contact, the way of speech to that older person conveys the respect based in that difference and diversity in age, as in the example you were giving.
Yes, I that's certainly true also for African American culture as well. So I definitely resonate with what you're saying.
Yeah, good. And I get your point about receiving negative feedback and then you can make improvement on that.
Mhm.
But the way you expressed that, you said that if you view the negative feedback as diversity,
Mhm.
could you explain that a little more, Chloe?
I can try. So I read this book by James, forgot his last name. He wrote a book called Seeing Like a State, which basically is a critique of top-down approaches to government rule. One of the things he studies is actually how the diversity of a field of trees and plants, let's say, it's actually far more resilient when
Mm,
it comes to surviving epidemics, because you have, instead of a monocropped
yeah.
field, you have a very diverse crop, and so it can withstand hardship. And there's a metaphor to be drawn out there, I think, in the business world, which is when I am putting out a product, and let's say in my head, it's amazing, it's incredible, in the abstract sense, but I put it out and it doesn't work as well in terms of, from a user interface perspective. It doesn't work as well as I would have hoped from a being continuous with my customers' everyday schedule. I need to know that feedback. I need to be able to hear that feedback directly from the customer. Now, when they're going through this service or this product that they're engaging with, my initial feeling when I receive that feedback is, oh, I wish I had thought of that, right? I wish I had made it
Yeah.
better. But the truth is, I could not have thought of it without putting it out there and
Yeah.
without receiving that feedback directly from the customer, who is by definition diverse, right? It's the person who's not the builder, the person who is on the receiving end, the person who has a million things to do, right? The person whose attention is necessarily divided because they are in their own ecosystem doing their job. And for a Theory of Enchantment's case, we work with employees in other companies that go through our training process. So they already have an ecosystem which is not ours. So there's diversity there between us. And then within their ecosystem itself, there's managers, there's executive teams, there's frontline workers, depending upon what industry we're working in. So there's diversity within the ecosystem we're working with, and then there's diversity between our two ecosystems. And if I come into this field without an appreciation for that diversity and an understanding of the richness of what their perspective, or how their perspective can shape and mold how I build a product or service. If I come at that with a sort of unwillingness to adapt my product or my service in a flexible manner, then the company will not succeed. So that's
Yeah.
sort of what I mean by receiving feedback. And this goes both ways, right? It scales up and down. It scales in the direction of me receiving feedback from the customer, but it also scales in the direction of me receiving feedback from my colleague. And so that way it actually is both horizontal and vertical, and it makes for a far more robust product development process.
Mm, yeah, I totally get that, and you've expanded my comprehension of diversity there. Right, that's making
Success.
it far broader, which is
Yeah.
great. I use the analogy of an ecosystem too, right? Monoculture will not survive.
Right.
One little disease comes along and everything is wiped out, right? But the
Right.
diversity of a healthy ecosystem is what makes it resilient, isn't it? And
Exactly.
yeah, exactly the case with a team, a group of people working together. If everyone's seeing things the same way, they're going to miss so much.
Exactly.
But the irony is, isn't it, that the person who's most diverse in that group is likely to be the person who is least likely to speak up, because they don't feel that sense of belonging or safety to be able to
Yes.
express their point of view. So that's why psychological safety in that diverse team enables that sense of belonging and inclusion. Then you get the value of the diversity to the group.
Yes. It's like in order to create a diverse field, the soil must, and the soil is the psychological safety piece in the metaphor here. The soil must be fertile in order for the diverse crop to emerge, expand, and thrive in that ecosystem.
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. And I know there's a poem by Nell Morton, a feminist theologian, who talks about the edges that blur. You who like the sharp edges, watch for the edges that blur. And this is about the intersection, isn't it, of these two different views that come together. And that's where so much creativity and learning and growth happens.
I love that. I was actually recently thinking about this archetype of the jester or the joker. I've been thinking about this archetype for a long time, and historically speaking, in many cultures and traditions, this is the archetype that is the source of that blurring. So for example, if you look at different religious traditions, holidays like Purim within Jewish culture, or Carnival within both Catholic, because I'm from New Orleans, so like Carnival's Mardi Gras, right? But also more, let's say, South American, Brazilian cultures. Historically speaking, Europe had this through the expression of the Feast of the Saturnalia, which became Christmas, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, right? The main narrator is a jester who tells the story of the Hunchback. We talked about Disney earlier. So there's this archetype within human consciousness known as the jester, who's always blurring the lines, who's always inviting the audience to be aware of the topsy-turvy nature of reality itself. And in our culture, I guess broadly speaking, it could be called Western culture, but I understand the limitation of that. The culture, at least that I sit in, we are very afraid of that that sense of it can feel chaotic, basically, to know that there's like the blurring of the lines. But it's precisely in that space that you're describing where such richness can emerge.
Yeah, absolutely. You need to leave room for a little bit of chaos, right?
Yeah. And play also, right? Because the jester plays and is playful, and that capacity to remember to not take things so seriously that you forget that control is an illusion, right? That's really what the jester is trying to remind us of. So the playful piece is really, really important here as well.
Love that. Love this, the archetype of the jester. Great. All right. And really it's deep in our psyche, isn't it? Like you say, whatever culture we are in, there is that person, that archetype. Yeah. Let me talk for a minute about Disney, right? Because I know you use Disney movies in your work, right? I've noticed many of the heroes in Disney movies and stories are not accepted, and they're isolated. I think of the Beast in Beauty and the Beast, Cinderella, Rapunzel, Elsa in Frozen. Mirabelle in Encanto, they're kind of isolated because of something about them, right? They don't fully belong in the group.
They're in the liminal space.
The liminal space, all right. So do you see, we're talking about microvalidation, so accepting people for their difference and calling that out and valuing it. It occurred to me that this seems to happen to these characters often by the sidekick or the minor character that they work with. I think of Mrs. Potts in Beauty and the Beast, right? Lumiere the candle. They kind of support the Beast who is isolated. Is this an example that you could point to and say, well, this is a kind of like a micro validation happening?
I hadn't thought of that before, Peter, to be honest, but it's a great point. It's a great observation. And I would have to really pause and think more about the implications of the side character sort of launching major plots in a lot of these films. I will say, just thinking back on the development of the theory of enchantment, it has often been advocates. We've often had advocates within organizations who have done our online course,
Right.
who will push for months at a time other executives or other change makers in the organization to consider us. And these characters, if I may play with the metaphor here, these characters are not, would not necessarily or typically be viewed as the quote unquote main character, but in fact they are in their own way. And if you shift the perspective, in fact they are the main character, right? But it is interesting how things unexpectedly sort of pop off, because this person in this context over here in this department, found theory of enchantment, became really excited and delighted by it, and then pushed it onto the executive or pushed the executive team to discover. So I can see parallels in my own relationship with the work that I do. And certainly it is the case that this reinforces the need to encourage diversity of opinion within a given ecosystem, because you never know what you might discover by allowing for that. So I will have to think more about that. That's interesting.
Okay. Okay, good. All right. I mean, it's interesting that there's someone in the organization often who is kind of a minor figure, who
quote unquote.
Yeah. I mean, they turn out to have a major influence for good, right? But on the organization chart, maybe they're not, the most prominent person,
right?
But they see value in what you're doing, and they use their influence.
Absolutely. It also gives new meaning or weight to the word minority.
Yeah, true.
Right? So there's something there for sure.
And I don't know what you think of this idea, but I think a little bit about teams in the organization, and there's often someone in that team who is like the auntie or uncle in the community, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
they're more senior. They may not occupy that prominent place on the organization chart, but there's someone who's quietly influential.
Sure.
Do you recognize those people as well?
I do, and they're not necessarily, the term doesn't necessarily code as a age specific role, but when I hear the term auntie, there's a lot of warmth in that role. There's a lot of big-heartedness in the role. Yeah. And so regardless of the age or the gender of the person, there are certain people who in addition to being perhaps a minor character of some sort, often have this quality about them that is compassionate, optimistic, open, really enchanting in a profound way.
Right.
And you want to be around them because their energy is very beautiful and infectious and makes you feel good. And I've definitely noticed that in many of the people I've had the privilege of working with outside of theory of enchantment, who become our partners in bringing this work into other ecosystems.
And it seems like we should find a way to recognize and acknowledge that kind of energy in people in organizations and teams, right? And they're not necessarily the boss or the leader, but they have that, like you say, that type of energy that is really valuable and attractive, and helps sort out problems in that organizational ecosystem.
Absolutely. And we should also find ways to cultivate that type of energy so that other people feel empowered to embody it.